Good afternoon, everyone, as always, and thanks for joining today. My name is Dan Maloof, Senior Director of Product here at Dines. Excited to be hosting this week's tech briefing. As a quick refresher for potentially any new folks on the line, the purpose of these 30-minute briefings is to dive into the relevant InfoSec news stories of the week and provide you with some specific actionable guidance to take back to your teams. With that as a backdrop, I'm thrilled to be joined today by two INS faculty rock stars, Wolf Gorlick and Jake Williams. Wolf is the Chief Information Security Officer for Michigan's Oakland County, and Jake is VP of R&D at Hunter Strategy and a former startup founder with decades of experience in technology and security. Wolf and Jake, thanks so much for joining today.
Yeah, good to be here.
All
Pleasure.
right. All right, let's take a look at the agenda today. First topic we're going to discuss is another instance of lost logs. In this case, it was Cloudflare. So some seems to be a pattern happening more and more. I know we talked about, well, maybe not Cloudflare, but we saw Microsoft do this. This happened a few weeks ago, so more to discuss there. That should be an interesting one. After that, we're going to discuss the latest details on the LogoFAIL flaw. So, there was some recently uncovered research, BootKitty Linux UEFI bootkit that exploits the LogoFAIL flaw. So we'll get into that a little bit into the weeds there. And then finally, we're going to discuss Russian hackers targeting Firefox with 0 days as part of a widespread hacking campaign. So a lot of good stuff to get to today. Without further ado, I'm going to start with you, Jake. If you want to take first crack at the Cloudflare log story, what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, always happy to talk about missing logs here, but I I'm going to leave the log part of this for Wolf, right? And to discuss that a little bit. The TLDR here is yeah, for 3.5 hours, right? Cloudflare did not send logs to customers who had requested them and probably need them for compliance reasons. And dot 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 dot, right? What's more interesting to me, at least from my perspective to discuss, is the operational resilience side of this because man, if you are running high availability systems, or listen, even if you don't think you're running high availability systems, I promise your stakeholders think you are. They expect that availability to be there. And this is a fantastic case study of a cascading failure. Effectively, what happens here is that there's obviously Cloudflare generates ridiculous numbers of logs, right? It's like trillions of logs a day. And most of those don't get delivered to customers. Most customers don't need those. They don't want them. They are, logging and relying on logs, not on the CDN layer. But for the customers that are and do want those logs, Cloudflare needs to route those. And so they have effectively a routing system. And the rules for that routing system get rebuilt they say every few minutes. I'm sure it's sitting on a cron job or something like that. And many years ago, they implemented a fail-safe with this service called Log Forwarder that would fail open. And man, I tell you, I think about some of my first conversations ever with Wolf, right? And we were talking just OG cybersecurity stuff. And I remember actually having a fail open, fail close discussion as I'm writing up the write up here. I was thinking about, man, how apropos, right, that I'm on with Wolf today, given that those are some of our first discussions, is because there's no right answer from a security perspective to the fail open or fail closed. It's completely situational. Um, Cloudflare looks and says, hey, high assurance, these are logs. Let's look at our failure modes, right? Worst case, if we fail open, right, then we're going to deliver some logs to everybody, right? So, meaning we're going to deliver logs to people that didn't ask for them. But if we have this weird condition where there's an empty configuration, which is what happened, people that really needed their logs, that wanted their logs, are still going to get them. As this thing goes to fail open, though, they haven't tested it as the system is scaled. This worked perfectly, worked exactly the way it was supposed to, and crushed the buffering system that ultimately handles the large spike kind of activity. And of course, this would definitely be that, a large spike of activity. It crushed that system. And Cloudflare engineers were unable to ultimately salvage the logs that were in the buffers. They ultimately ended up having to do effectively a cold start of the system, losing those 3.5 hours of logs. Folks, and again, I'm going to turn it over to Wolf here, right, to talk about some logging stuff and his opinions on this. But the big takeaway here, has nothing to do with Cloudflare and it has nothing to do with their logs. Read the linked blog post and take this back to your teams and ask them how they're architecting. Because odds are good you've got dozens of these circumstances inside your environments. Wolf, what are your thoughts on this?
I'll pivot to logs in a minute, but I think what you're teasing at is so true. When you set up your business continuity and disaster recovery options, you test them like, oh, I've got a paper test and I've got a unit test and I've got a walkthrough, and you test them in isolation. And it's so frequent that when there's a real event, that things don't come up in the right order, things don't work in the right order, or as happened here, a downstream component fails because your upstream component was tested and verified in isolation in perfect conditions.
Yeah.
So yeah, Jake, I love how you pulled out that conduit. As an old school like BCDR guy, I'm right there with you. I'm like, yeah, like we've seen this again and again and again. The logging, around the time that you and I were arguing about failed open, failed closed, I had inherited a web application that was hosted, and within the SLA, there was a guarantee of logging. They were logging and monitoring for us. So lo and behold, we get attacked, and I pick up, the phone or shoot an email. I forget how I contact him. I'm like, we need to do logging. What's the log show? I need to access those logs. I said, all right, here's the process. You put in a ticket and within 24 hours, we'll turn on the logging and we'll log for 8 hours. I'm like, what? Like, oh, I need to like coordinate with the attackers. Like, please tell me when you're going to attack so I can enable my log, so I can put in a change order. What is this? And so much has changed over the recent years. We expect logs these days, right? This idea that, oh, we'll request them or it'll be a periodic thing is way gone away. So the customer side of this had me wondering, like, what is it that says, what is your SLA for logging, for one? Is that part of your vendor onboarding? Is it part of your, RFP reviews, your architecture reviews? Because just because they say, oh, we're doing full logging, as we see with Cloudflare, doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to give full availability. Now, I think Cloudflare has done the right thing to try and make people whole. And we can argue with whether or not that 3.5 hours um, justifies, some legal action. I'll say 3.5 hours, the right 3.5 hours are critical hours where I need those logs. So it's kind of a hit or miss. But it does remind me, like, you've got to be looking at, if your security controls include logging, and yes, they do, then you have to be looking at the SLA for all your security controls, including these types of things.
Yeah,
Uh,
no, and that's that's huge. You talk about the logging piece too. I'm interested in your take because you mentioned, to your point, right? The right 3.5 hours can be catastrophic, right? The right 3.5 minutes of loss can be
right.
catastrophic. Cloudflare primarily these logs, are CDN and WAF related logs. How do you develop compensating controls for that? With a customer to say, hey, I mean, because this is the kind of tabletop thing. Like I do, probably tabletop a week on average, right, with somebody.
Mhm. Yeah.
Um, every 2 weeks, maybe, whatever. But we get into consistently like, well, that scenario would never happen. Well, it's a great case study here. How do you mitigate that, or do you mitigate that? Is that high enough up the stack that you're thinking about it, Wolf?
So someone is using a bot and they're bypassing your WAF, and they notice the logging is down, and that's when they strike, right? Like, and you have a 3.5 hour window where they can have time on target with no visibility. Certainly. So what do you do for compensating around that, right? If you have those gaps. Well, this is the thing that you oftentimes tabletop, which is if I lose a log source, where else can I see it? Can I see it upstream? Can I see it downstream? If I'm not seeing it at my Cloudflare level, I should have, as I'm imagining a infrastructure, I got Cloudflare in front of it, and I'm going through a WAF or a simple proxy. Maybe I have it at the WAF layer, maybe I have it Nginx, or within the application layer if I have good telemetry. But that brings back me sort of full circle to BCDR. BCDR starts as an exercise to assume availability. From security, it should assume your availability of your security controls and your ability to maintain those, and
Mhm.
also it should assume fail over those controls. Right? If I lose this control, I have visibility either earlier on in the attack path or later on in the attack path.
Yeah. No, I think that's critical, and you really teased out the point I was going to drive home, if not, right? Is that application layer logging, right? Because Everything ends at the application. And so, in this case, I don't think we have anything upstream from Cloudflare in the vast majority of situations.
Usually
I think,
no.
yeah, I think they're the upstream terminus, right, if you will. But downstream, right, back in our own application land, right, we definitely can be processing those logs. And if I was going to throw out one piece of advice from, been there, done that, have the battle scars, the vast majority of your application developers log on, when they're logging any IP addresses or logging source IP, and when you're using a CDN like Cloudflare, and they rely on the CDN like Cloudflare to go and break that back out, but you have to log X forward for. You just have to, right? That X forwarded for IP address, make sure that all the IPs in your logs aren't Cloudflare. When you lose the Cloudflare logs, you can't piece that back together, right? So just log X forwarded for in the first place. Cut out the middleman there, and it's resilient to changes too.
So Jake, there's a question in here. How do you measure the impact of this? Is there a way to attach priorities to log records to keep the high and drop the low events in situations like this?
I don't think you can, right? I guess if you wanted to ask me, could we design a system to do that? Sure. I think though here I don't think that's warranted. I think here, it's merely making sure that we have the space to buffer, right? So if we're going to rely on a fail open event like this, or rely on a fail open control like this to ensure availability, we have to make sure our downstream systems are resilient for that. That could be done purely with auto scaling, right? Which it doesn't sound like Cloudflare really had in place. They had sufficient excess capacity in their postmortem, right? They talk about they had sufficient excess capacity for practically any event but this, right? And it just wasn't designed to go and auto scale to this level. So I think that's probably the better answer than creating prioritization. But I'm interested, what's your take on that?
Yeah, you have to prioritize by log source
Yeah,
oftentimes, right? Because if the logs aren't available, they're unavailable.
sure,
Now,
sure.
if you put yourself not on the customer side, but in Cloudflare side, I have seen that happen. We will drop, we used to do this all the time with networking monitoring
Yeah.
when you couldn't keep up with the top. Like if we get saturated, we're first going to drop like, certain packets. We'll keep
Hmm.
the auth ones. We'll keep certain classifications. So there are ways to do it if you work Cloudflare, but from the customer side, yeah, you're not doing that. And that sort of ties into the next question, which is like, where do you draw the line of multiple copies? Uh,
Hmm.
you know, more.
Yeah.
The it is a good point, right? Because everything costs money, everything costs
Hmm.
time and complexity. So I want back to the, CDN. I'm not going to want to log every single thing across the CDN, but I will want to log certain things within my application that are unknown fraud paths.
That's it. Yeah, that's it. My take on the how many copies, right? How much is enough? That's not a decision that I get to make, right? In the vast majority of organizations, I'm the security guy. Even if I'm advising the CISO, heck, most CISOs, right, aren't we look at publicly traded companies, they are not the effective risk manager, right, for the risk acceptor for the organization. And so your job as a security person is to go back and say, hey, this is a real failure mode. This is a thing that has really happened. It will happen again sooner or later. Here is the cost to effectively mitigate that. And you let stakeholders, risk managers, make those decisions. You're the one providing them with the data to make those decisions, though, in my opinion. So,
Mhm.
Right on. Awesome. Great discussion there. Let's move to the second topic if that works for you guys. Who wants to take first crack at logo failure? I know we've talked about it in the past, but it's rearing back up. Who wants to either of you take first crack?
So I can take first
Both.
crack,
good.
and then Jake can do all the in-depth malware cool stuff. I'll be like, oh, look, computers are a thing. No, if you were following LogoFAIL, it was about a year ago, a combination of several exploitable vulnerabilities in the UEFI layer, effectively doing a custom logo request into the BIOS allowed you to enable and drop malware at the BIOS level, which is then a bootkit type path. Now, as we all know, anywhere you have inputs, anywhere you have the ability to send data is an attack surface. So this wasn't entirely surprising, although it was a pretty clever thing. Now, a year ago, we're like, oh, this is pretty clever. We should keep an eye out for that. Guard your computers. Remind everyone not to leave computers out in public places and everything else. But it's theoretical. No one's really using it. Kind of interesting, kind of neat, but would that really scale? Would attackers really use it? Well, we found out this week that it is being seen in the wild. There's a new rootkit called BootKitty. I always love the freaking names. Never change, security people, never change. That is using this to deploy. Now it's possibly tied back to students in South Korea. So we have that whole nation state angle. Um, is this a major thing to be concerned about? This is what I want to hear from Jake. But obviously, certain things come to mind, right? Like your vulnerability management program, you better be patching, you better be keeping up your computers. Um, does it include visibility into your firmware? You're going to want to check that. A lot of course, network scanning or certainly unauthenticated scanning is not going to pick up on this. Some of the host-based ones will. So like your XDR, NDR tools that are also dueling as your vulnerability scanners should be able to see this. Is it included in your patch? That's another thing. In the run up to this, I was like, hey, when's the last time we patched our firmware on our notebooks? I'm like, why? Okay, good. Let's have some conversations. So that's where I would start, which is this used to be theoretical. We had a good year to get out of it. Some of us, I'm sure, in this call did. Many of us did not. Now that it's happening, it's time to revisit some of those fundamentals and make sure it's including this threat vector within those fundamental scope programs scope.
Yeah. Now this is part of a much, much, much broader problem, right? Wolf hit on exactly the reason that I picked this out as one of them that I wanted to cover. I don't think that this is like a, oh my gosh, 5 alarm fire kind of problem here. I didn't think it was when, we briefed it last year. But I do think it's important to revisit what are we doing for vulnerability management at the UEFI level. Probably everyone on the call here knows, Windows 11 requires certain hardware requirements. Some of our legacy devices don't work on it, and why? And it's because that TPM, and that TPM is required for trusted boot through UEFI, right? Microsoft's got the whole secure from boot to cloud kind of thing. It's like woohoo, but there is a reality to that, right? And that's what LogoFAIL exploits. Right?
Yeah.
It breaks the secure boot process. As Wolf mentioned, when this first got reported last week, it was ESET was basically saying, "Hey, this is we found the sample on VirusTotal, which means it's almost certainly in the wild, kind of thing." Now, there's an interesting kind of chicken egg problem here because Wolf mentioned visibility. The vast majority of us don't have it, right? Unless you've got something like who are they? I'm looking for my hat here. Binarly, somebody, yeah, Binarly. Unless you've got somebody like them, let's just be real, man. You're probably not seeing this. And so seeing this once it's once your machine's infected. By the way, Paul Asadorian gave a fantastic talk at ShmooCon. I can't remember if it was last year or the year before, but like on all kinds of other firmware, I don't know whether you call them vulnerabilities or issues, right, that would allow people to bypass secure boot as well, right? And that's online. Go watch the video. It's fantastic. But if you're interested in this kind of stuff. But it all brings us back to something that we have put in the too hard bucket in most vulnerability management programs, and that's patching BIOS. And I get it. I guess I could reach down and show, but whatever. I have 2 Lenovo mobile workstations that I refuse to patch the firmware on. Again, they've both been replaced by Lenovo, and it's a one-off model. Never buy the one-off model, even never buy a new model because it may end up being the one-off, right? But I refuse to update the firmware on them, right? Because they've had nothing but Thunderbolt issues, afterwards. Mobile workstations are god awful expensive. These are the 96 and 128 gig of RAM, laptops that you're carrying around here, and so. I won't update the firmware on them again because I know this stuff causes issues. And I get it. This is a hard balancing act to get into in enterprise, right? Where it's like, it's not broke, don't mess with it, right? But we now have an example, right, of code that, albeit right, from some South Korean cybersecurity researchers, right, in an academic program, but still, right? The other thing I want to bring up here too is that you absolutely need to go talk to your teams about is counterintelligence threats with VirusTotal. Right? If you don't have a private VirusTotal instance, and even if you do an enterprise VirusTotal instance, if you have people outside of the folks that have access to that using core VirusTotal, anything you upload to VirusTotal, researchers like me can download. I know you can't, right? Unless you have a VTI key, VirusTotal intelligence key, but researchers can, and that's how ESET found this. Right. So
Mm.
ESET found this in VirusTotal. They had YARA rules set up looking for specific things, and this tripped something of interest. And they ultimately ended up downloading it. And then analyzing it and publishing on it. The researchers later saw this and was like, oh snap, that's us, right? And then contacted some media and said, hey, so about that. But now I want you to step back and think about some of the other stuff that you've probably uploaded to VirusTotal, right? And that your organization has uploaded to VirusTotal. And because I've seen amazing, like confidential data in VirusTotal, I've seen custom binaries, right, that contain lots of embedded intellectual property and algorithmic data. You name it, right? And that stuff can all be pulled out as well. So this is a great time to use this as a meta example, right? One, talk to your vulnerability management folks, but two, go to your CTI folks, and CTI, incident response, SOC, right? And have this discussion around hey, what do we upload? And how could that possibly come back to bite us? And maybe have some hard discussions about that.
Right on. Wolf, any final thoughts on that?
No, I'm taking notes.
Perfect. All right, cool. Let's keep it moving then. I want to talk a little bit about Firefox. Jake, you want to take the first crack at this one? Russian hackers targeting Firefox. What's the interesting piece here? You want to throw it to Wolf first? Is that
I'm
you
going to
think?
throw it to Wolf first because
Yeah.
these first two were ones I was passionate about. And then I was kind of like, we always do three. I'm like, I could do the Firefox O days. And that's all I put in the email. And I had a reason for it. And then Wolf replies back with, I'd only do the third one and it was exactly the reason I wanted to. Wolf, I'm going to kick it to you, my friend. Go.
Boom. So, security firm ESET has identified that RomCom is using an exploit chain of two zero-day vulnerabilities to take over Firefox. Obviously, the battle for the browser comes and goes in waves. Zero-day exploits of browsers come and go in waves. The first thing that really struck me about this, and gets back to what Shake, you and I were emailing about, is I'm a big fan of passwordless. I'm a big fan of multi-factor. I'm a big fan of zero trust. If you think about these controls, you go to launch one of these applications, right? And what happens? Well, I check where you're from. I check, maybe your MDM. I check some status of your device. I do, force authentication. Maybe I'm doing, full on biometrics and I'm doing, that level of authentication. And then I'm going to check a couple other things. And all these things are going to happen. And all these hurdles are going to get passed. And then, and only then, do you get this string of text that goes in the browser that if anyone takes over the browser, you can take over those sessions. Now, certainly there's some caveats and we can have that conversation, but I really keep a clean eye on browser defense because all these controls that we put in front of it, disappear in a heartbeat when I just have a SAML assertion that I can copy, paste, and load in another browser.
I was going to say, yeah, all that. I want you to take here, Wolf, by the way, folks, I have not prepped Wolf for this at all. So Wolf, feel free to be like, no, if this is too spot on here. I've got a lot of clients that are going all in on enterprise browsers, right? So the islands of the world, Talon a
Yeah.
little bit less so, but the enterprise browsers of the world. How do you contextualize? Because what you said is dead on, right? Make no mistake about it, folks. What he said is dead on. How do you square that circle of now my browser is extending into the desktop footprint a little bit with
Well,
with ODays, right?
what I like about the secure, okay, so yes, if there is a ODay exploit at the browser level and it's one of these secure browsers, you have even greater reach, right? Like the blast radius has now gotten bigger.
Yeah.
By contrast, ostensibly, what we're paying for is a team that's constantly beating up on these browsers and hardening them and taking steps. So the risk of that, the impact goes up because our attack surface goes up. The likelihood should be going down
Hmm.
because these things should be discovered. When I saw Firefox, one of the things that just freaks me out, back to our earlier conversation about vulnerability management, where is Firefox in most enterprises? It's on the exception list for these 10 applications that we can't retire yet on these few desktops, and don't worry about it because, it's a caveat, caveat, caveat. So how I square it is to say, hopefully the likelihood goes down and we've got enterprise controls around it, because for so many folks with Firefox, um, it is an exception and ignored and in pockets of the enterprise, which means how long is it even going to take to patch these 0 days?
Yep, right on. Jake, do you want to answer that question just live real quick? The guy, know it's about LogoFAIL
Yeah, I was starting to
previous
type it
topic.
here.
So
So I,
yeah,
I think it's unlikely to be exploited in most cases due to the difficulty of, you have two problems here, right? Logo fails to get you past UEFI, but then I have to from UEFI do something meaningful. Which by the way, if you've never done UEFI work before, don't. It's just painstaking, right? I'm a guy who likes to code in C. I reverse engineer assembly. I don't like UEFI. And so, I mean, I do kernel work and I still don't like UEFI. You're not going to run a full rootkit in UEFI. What you're doing is you're creating something to inject into an operating system. A running operating system. And now you have lots of other problems, right? Because those operating systems update over time. It's possible, right? 100% possible you could do it. But your IoT devices are running stripped down kernels that themselves are very difficult to change, right? So like my core idea for UEFI bootkit, right, would be to inject something into runtime memory every time we boot on a standard Linux kernel, right, and take over some routine that allows me some backdoor. I'm just kind of spitballing here. That is orders of magnitude harder on IoT. I'm having to develop for very specific versions of IoT. And so possible, yes, but it's that much harder to exploit too, because LogoFAIL first, I have to be local. It's not a remote exploit. I've got to be local on the box in a privileged context first. And that's my first challenge with IoT. So, we're talking Rube Goldberg level, dependency chaining here. And of course, I say this, right, knowing that, Rapid7 chained what, 5 days together to exploit an IP camera and pwn to own last week, right? So, I, talking out of both sides of my mouth here. So, yeah, what if your exploit's just to cause denial of service? Again, I can already, you put me in a privileged context on an IoT device, bricking the device is pretty easy, right? So I don't need LogoFAIL to do that. So LogoFAIL, you should think about LogoFAIL as having a singular purpose of messing up secure boot, right? So,
right on.
and I want to come back real quick on the enterprise browser thing and
Yeah,
challenge one
finish
note
finish
here.
us up with that. Yeah.
Yeah. I do agree that we have whole groups of people that are, obviously doing vulnerability, assessment, right, against these enterprise browsers. But they are based on Chromium, right? And Chromium itself has Chrome, right, specifically has ODays itself all the time that aren't being discovered by these groups, right? And I want to note that, right? Like if you go to the Chrome vulnerability list, right, and then you look at how many of these vulnerabilities were submitted by Island, I think we can then start talking about the reality of that security testing, right? Now, at the same time, the folks that are doing these enterprise browsers are dramatically increasing the attack surface of the browser itself, right? And so for me, enterprise browsers, I'll close with this. I'm not anti-enterprise browser, but I am all about making a very adult decision, recognizing that the additional telemetry and control surfaces that I get come with additional attack surfaces. And honestly, if I'm somebody like State Department, where I know threat actors are, constantly targeting me and any attack surface is going to get beat up on, that's probably one where it falls away. Pretty much anybody else, yeah, I want the extra control. Right.
Yeah,
So
great
Well,
point.
final thought, or you get
No, we're at the bottom of the hour. I think that's a fantastic point. It's trade-offs,
sounds
right?
good.
Security is all about trade-offs.
That's it. That's it.
Right on.
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, that was awesome. Thanks, Jake. Thanks, Wolf. Really appreciate the time today. And yeah, let's do this again soon.
Awesome. Thanks.
All right, gents. Take care.
Cheers, folks.